Good afternoon, and welcome to you all. Thank you very much for joining us today on this wonderful occasion. I am Lee Durrell, Honorary Director, Durrell Wildlife Conservation Trust. And we're here today to celebrate conservation victories and to honor the heroes recognized and rewarded by the Indianapolis Prize, which is widely regarded as the Nobel Prize for Animal Conservation. No one explains this better than Sir David Attenborough.
Life on Earth is an ever-unfolding story. There's drama, comedy, action, and tragedy. Now the story has reached a pivotal point, and what happens next depends on what we humans do. Clearly, we're capable of great things. We've travelled untold distances, explored uncharted territories, invented new worlds. But now it's time to turn our attention to our world. A world in which we share so much with our fellow life forms. We also share a future that today, more than ever, we have a responsibility to foster and protect. Conservation isn't a job, it's a life commitment. It's built on a foundation of curiosity and wonder, and the bold scientific achievements of the past. And lives on in the pioneering work and dedication of those honoured by the Indianapolis Prize. These are the heroes of Earth's ongoing story, the ones upon whom so much of our future depends. They're not just our dreamers, but also our doers. They are the ones with the will to make a difference. Thanks to them, we still have the one thing that every good story needs: hope. That is why we're here. The next chapter is ours to write. This is the Indianapolis Prize.
Gives me great pleasure to introduce Mike Crowther, who is President of the Indianapolis Prize and Chief Executive of the Indianapolis Zoo. Mike.
Well, good job. Thank you, Dr. Durrell. The Durrell Wildlife Conservation Trust have played a defining role in modern wildlife conservation, and we're very pleased to be joining with you for this important occasion. The staff and the executive committee of the Indianapolis Prize are grateful that all of you have chosen to join us today, and it's particularly important to me to introduce Karen Burns, Executive Director of the Indianapolis Prize, to you. Karen. The Indianapolis Prize is widely known as the world's leading award for animal conservation because it bridges three ecosystems. The prize connects the worlds inhabited by wildlife with those mysterious places where scientists live, and then joins those with the popular interests of the public. Of course, that was an approach pioneered by a remarkable gentleman by the name of Jerry Durrell. There is no scientific activity being conducted anywhere in the world today that is more important than the science of wildlife conservation. Conservationists today are defining the world that we will live in tomorrow. They are preparing our legacy for our children and our grandchildren. They are establishing the textures of our landscapes, the color and the clarity of our skies and our waters, and the sounds that will sweeten our lives. But these scientists are doing so with an inappropriate anonymity. They are not greeted with the acclaim and the attention that we lavish on music stars and athletes. We do not hang on their every word. Every woman and man, every company and organization, every government and politician should be clamoring for the ears of the conservationists who are creating their futures. Will we have clean water? Will we have green valleys? Will our crops abound and thrive? Will we have the natural resources required by our industries and our lifestyles? Will there be birdsong? Will our nations flourish? What world will our grandchildren inherit? Today's conservationists are our knights, our champions. They are rigorously trained. They pursue the noblest of causes, and they do so with an outrageous humility and a sad lack of funds. The Indianapolis Prize recognizes and rewards those who have achieved the most extraordinary victories. It is our role to tell their stories and to sustain them in their fights. The winner of the Indianapolis Prize is a conservationist who has significantly improved the sustainability of an animal species or group of species. He or she receives an unrestricted monetary award of $250,000 and the Lilly Medal. The Indianapolis Prize is an international program addressing global challenges which are accepted and met by some of the most remarkable and accomplished scientists in the world. So it is appropriate that we introduce the 2016 recipient in London, a truly international city. The award will be presented at a gala in Indianapolis on October 15th. We've come to London to honor the Durrell Wildlife Conservation Trust, the Mauritian Wildlife Foundation, and especially to honor Professor Carl Jones. Yes, Professor Jones is a part of a team. Yes, he is learned from, he works alongside, and is supported by many, many good people. But because one remarkable individual is their champion, there are still at least 5 bird and 3 reptile species in our world that would otherwise be gone, extinct, forever. Professor Carl Jones is a global hero, and his work and methods can be replicated globally. And because he has not merely struggled hard against overwhelming odds for the benefit of all of us, but has actually won his battles, he is simply one of the most important people in the world.
I like to think about what the world is going to be like 100 years into the future. What do we want Mauritius to look like? Without nature, we become lesser human beings. We really do need to have beautiful things around us and natural things around us. Every individual on this world can make a difference, and we can go out there and we can actually achieve our dreams. My first reaction was, oh yeah, I've won the prize, and then it hit me like an express train, and I felt quite emotional. I was thinking about the people who inspired me as a young man.
Carl could have made his mark anywhere else in the world, and he decided to stay here and make his mark here on Mauritius. And all these species are now been saved and are in their hundreds.
and what he has done is so deeply significant to the world of conservation. It's action. It's saying there are no such things as lost causes. We can fix this.
He's achieved what most people would stand back and say is impossible.
Okay, so if you can bring it down, we can then have a closer look at it.
To be able to say that that person has actually saved a number of species.
Yeah! I always get excited when I handle kestrels, even though I've done it hundreds of times. Wow, isn't that just beautiful?
He made it happen because he believes it's right, and he believes that is what you should do. And, you know, I think people with that level of conviction is what the conservation world needs.
We have lost some totally remarkable creatures, and that actually is a great driver when you realise that these species that we're working with here could disappear completely. And for me, Mauritius without pink pigeons and echo parakeets and Mauritius kestrels would be a much duller place.
Ladies and gentlemen, it is my honor and my privilege to introduce Dr. Carl Jones as the 2016 winner of the Indianapolis Prize. They do it.
Thank you very much. I'm feeling a bit overwhelmed at the moment. Not surprisingly, it's lovely to see people sitting in the audience that have been involved with the work in Mauritius going back the last 4 decades. Yes, it's great to win the prize and to be recognised, but what we've got to realise, it's been a joint effort. And I think it's wonderful because the Indianapolis Prize was set up to celebrate conservation success. And when Chris Clark told me a number of years ago, I think we should try and put you forward for the Indianapolis Prize, I said, Chris, don't be so silly. The people who win those prizes work on pandas and polar bears and elephants. And he said, no, Carl, it really is for people like you who've been out there working for many, many years. And Chris put me forward, and I got the support from all my colleagues in Durrell, Leanne, Rich, Donna, Andrew, and Lee. And we've won. But isn't this just wonderful? Because it actually celebrates what we all believe in. Yes, we want tigers, and we want elephants and blue whales, but we also want to celebrate some of the more obscure species. This is what Jerry Durrell believed. He felt that all species were important, and in their own ways, a tail-faced skink or a Mauritius kestrel are just as important as tigers or elephants. And as a young man full of naivety, I thought, wow, one day I want to go and try and save endangered species. And when I first went to Mauritius, we had some very modest goals to try and breed various species in captivity, to try and, if we could breed enough, put them back into the wild. But all the time we had a dream that perhaps we could do a bit more. But at the time, in the late 1970s, a lot of people felt that many species were beyond saving. Some people felt that the Mauritius kestrel, which had declined to just 4 individuals in the wild in 1974, wasn't worth the effort. And when I think back to the early years in Mauritius, I was haunted by the quote from Norman Myers, essentially saying we should let species like the Mauritius kestrel become extinct. And we should be putting money into whole systems or into other species that are more likely to survive. But I was fortunate that I had the backing and support of a number of people who believed in the work I was doing. Of course, we all know about Gerald Durrell championing the efforts in Mauritius, but there were also many others. And I have to thank my friends in the media that helped a great deal in those early days. Julian Pettifer and Robin Brown and Bryony, who made films on our work that actually helped galvanize attention on these critically endangered species. And the work on the Mauritius kestrel actually started to drive work on other species, pink pigeons and echo parakeets. And what is really nice about this is that when you actually save a species like the echo parakeet, yes, of course, you're saving that one individual species, but you're also developing the techniques for helping many other threatened parrot species worldwide. There are 350 species of parrots in the world. 100 of them are endangered. All of them can be helped using the same techniques as the ones we've used in the echo parakeet. The echo parakeet was reduced to just one breeding pair and a few non-breeding birds, and is today the most successful parrot recovery ever, with way over 600 birds surviving in the wild. However, in the early days, do you know that people were criticizing much of the work we were doing with species? And they were saying, we shouldn't be putting money into these critically endangered species. We should be using that money to conserve whole systems. But we had a bigger agenda, and we believed that the work we were doing in species would actually drive work restoring systems. And that's exactly what happened. I followed in the tradition, the philosophy of Gerald Durrell, my mentor, and we believe passionately that working with species actually helps people focus on the problems the species face and to start restoring habitats, whole systems, and to rebuild whole ecosystems such as the one we're doing on Round Island. However, to be able to do this sort of work, you need to have a background. You need to understand what you're trying to restore. And we're very lucky that in Mauritius we have a very good written history, an ecological history. And I must pay tribute to some of my colleagues like Anthony Cheek and Julian Pender-Hume that have spent years trying to understand what pristine Mauritius was once like. Yes, we'd like to turn the clock back. We'd like to restore Mauritius to its pristine state, but that isn't going to happen. In a rapidly changing world, the best that we can do is to use ecological histories as a basis on which to plan future systems. And of course, the work on the species did grow into developing system work. This is our field station on Round Island, designed by Vic Ash, built by Daz and Pete. Well done. Still in use today. We use lots of skills in Mauritius. You know, there's not just scientists, but there's people who are very practical people. Some people who are good at controlling predators, although I'm not meant to talk about killing things. Is that all right? But a whole host of skills. All sorts of people have contributed to the work we're doing. Media people, scientists, conservationists. And I have to pay tribute to all these organizations. These are only some of them. Let's just look at them for a moment. The Peregrine Fund, the World Parrot Trust, supported us for decades. Durrell, of course, Wildlife Vets International. Natural History Museum, we've been involved with them for many years, helping us to understand what pristine Mauritius was once like. They've also been guiding us in understanding the taxonomy of the species we're working with and helping us with regards to advising us on which species to put where. But also there are some very important partners, such as Chester Zoo. Chester have supported us for over 2 decades. And virtually every year for the last 20 years, we've had staff from Chester coming out to help us. Some of them are sitting in the audience, hatching eggs, raising babies. And this is the sort of collaboration that's needed. This is a role for zoos. The future role for zoos is not breeding self-sustaining populations in captivity. That's a role, but it's not the primary role. The primary role for zoos is getting out there in the field and taking captive breeding skills into nature. You'll also see a number of universities there. And we've been very fortunate that we have long-term relations with many universities. In the early days, when we were working on the birds in Mauritius, I felt it was important that we collected as much data as we could to try and understand the problems the species were facing and how we could use that data to inform conservation management. And I was very lucky that I worked with Bob Byrne, who was a very good friend of mine, who helped set up some of the early databases. And then later, I started working closely with universities, with Diana Bell, who has helped me a great deal over many years by sending students and advising us, and helping us to develop our scientific program. I also have to mention some of the students that did their work with us. There's Jim and Malcolm that did their PhDs with me, and now send their own PhD students to Mauritius. So perhaps I'm an academic grandfather, I'm not sure. But anyway, over the years, we've had nearly 100 higher degrees done in Mauritius. And they have set down the foundation stones for the work we do today. But it's still a challenge, you know. We do the science. And we all say that conservation needs to be directed by science. But that's actually quite a difficult thing to do. We still haven't got it right. There's a mismatch between what we do in the field and what science tells us we should be doing. And we have to work very hard to try and correct that. But I've been very lucky that I have had a number of academic peers who have helped a great deal. And I have to thank Ken Norris. Ken is my tame academic. He's helped in many ways over the years, helping us understand what's happening with the populations in Mauritius, and sent a whole suite of students working on a number of species: kestrels, pigeons, parrots, fodies, and now round island petrels. And it's been a very fruitful relationship, and I hope it's going to continue further into the future. You'll see we have strong relations with University of Kent and also with Cardiff. But what we want is not short-term questions, academics just to answer short-term questions, but long-term commitment to help us resolve conservation issues. We've done a lot of science in the field, and this has to become an integral part. How do we integrate it is actually quite a difficult thing. And of course, we haven't always had the resources. In fact, we still don't have the resources to do all the conservation work that we want to do. So we have to rely heavily on students and on volunteers. And over the last 30 years, we've had nearly 1,000 people come through the program in Mauritius as volunteers, interns, or students. We've had people from all over the world. But what is really encouraging is that we've seen increasing involvement of Mauritians. And we've seen a lot of Mauritians develop skills, and for them to take over a lot of the work that I started. This is Vikash Tataya, who did his PhD with me on the round island petrel. And Vikash now runs the Mauritian Wildlife Foundation on a day-to-day basis. For me, one of the most satisfying things in Mauritius is that a number of years ago, I started to arrange my succession, to step back. And I thought that would be a very difficult thing to do, but actually it's been one of the most rewarding things I've ever done, to be able to stand back and see other people take over my role. It's often been stated that the greatest compliment for a teacher is that his students should exceed him in ability. Well, that happened many years ago on Mauritius. And virtually all the field workers are far better than I ever was. All the scientists are infinitely better. And together, we seem to have put it all together and actually come up with a lot of success. So, I stand on the shoulders of giants, but I also stand on the shoulders of my volunteers and my students. So there's no doubt about that. So over the years, we've developed a lot of capacity in Mauritius, and I have to thank the Mauritian Wildlife Foundation, Debbie de Chazal, who's executive director, who's done a fantastic job in running the organization, and Tim, our chairman. But what started off as a very modest organization, we're now over 120 people, and the largest NGO probably in the Mascarenes. Certainly the largest conservation NGO in the Mascarenes. And more recently, we've taken the work of conservation and turned it into a bit of a training school. We noted that many of the volunteers sitting in the audience today had gained a great deal from Mauritius, learned a great deal from their experience. And so I said, well, why don't we develop that further and develop a training school? And Jamie Copsey actually took the idea and ran and set up a postgraduate training diploma. And we now get people from all over the world coming to work in Mauritius and to learn techniques on the ground. And next year, we're going to develop that postgraduate diploma into a master's degree. It's an international program. We get people from many countries, but we wanted to have a focus on Indian Ocean islands. And every year we give scholarships to people from Indian Ocean islands. And we think that this is a very important role, not just doing conservation, but showing people how to do that. And of course, among the students that have worked in Mauritius, I told you that some of them have become really far better than I ever was. Well, we have Nick there, who took over much of the reptile work. And as a result of his work, we have been able to increase the numbers of many species of reptiles. By restoring islands, moving reptiles around, improving their habitat. And we've seen a huge increase in the numbers of all our reptile species. A lot of people know about the successes with the birds. They'll be less familiar with the work with the reptiles. And we'll know even less about the work with the plants. But we've actually been successful in saving many species, improving their status. And it is claimed that there are at least 9 species where we have averted possible, probable, or certain extinction. So conservation does work. It not only works in that we can rebuild systems, but we can also, in some cases, bring back roles that have been lost because the original species has become extinct. The Mauritian giant tortoise, long extinct, but its role in the ecosystem is being restored by using Aldabra tortoises. This is an idea that we had 30 years ago, and at the time most people thought we were nuts. But as time has gone on, people have accepted that we can use ecological replacements. And it fills me with great pride to see that this idea is being developed by many of my colleagues, and it's nice to see that Dennis Hansen has taken this idea much further. And I think in the future we will be rebuilding systems, and when we have missing species, looking for ecological replacements. We all know about the bird projects, and we have been very successful. And if we actually look at what we've done in Mauritius, we can see that compared to the rest of the world, we are bucking the trend. all these species have increasing populations. If we look at the trend, the population trends of birds on islands, we can see that in recent decades there's been a decline. Let's compare that with those 7 bird species from Mauritius. Conservation works. And I think that is the message. And I think there's a very special message here. And that is that we have taken the philosophies of Gerald Durrell and developed them further. We are taking captive breeding type techniques and applying them to free living populations, and it's hugely successful. So the future, I think, looks very bright. We've learned how to restore species. We're learning how to restore systems, and in some cases even create novel systems. I've always been a bit of a dreamer. And when I first went to Mauritius, I thought to myself, one day I'm going to bring giant tortoises back to these islands. And of course, we've done that. Not just me, but a whole team of us have done that. I also want to bring back flightless rails. Some of you will know that because I keep going on about it all the time. But also, who knows, in years to come, we might actually be able to find ecological replacements for many of the extinct species. And I have a dream that one day my children will help me with that. As you probably know, I didn't start a family until quite late in life. I was too busy saving endangered species. I never thought about having a family. And then I stood back from Mauritius, and the next thing I knew, I had 2 children. And so Paula and the children and I would one day like to think that perhaps they could play a role in some of this conservation. And having children actually helps you focus your mind. Makes you realize just how wonderful the world is and how important it is to save all this diversity for ourselves and for future generations. And perhaps one day my children will be able to go to Round Island and release an ecological replacement for the dodo. Thank you very much.
Durrell Wildlife Conservation Trust and I have worked with Carl Jones for 37 years. And as happens when you work with a genius, our road together has had its ups and downs, its twists and turns, but the onward direction has remained steadfastly the same, the mission to save species from extinction. Very often, Carl himself took the lead as the creator of exciting new approaches to conservation, which Durrell has incorporated into its conservation toolbox and which many others have used around the world. For example, hands-on techniques for increasing these tiny populations of species on the very edge of extinction, and innovative ways of restoring degraded habitat so that the diverse species dependent on intact habitat have a future in the wild. It's been an honor and a privilege to work with Carl Jones. We are utterly thrilled that he's been awarded the Indianapolis Prize. We thank Mike, Karen, and everybody involved in the prize for their confidence in Carl, but also for providing so prominent a stage to raise the profile of conservation heroes and broadcast their achievements far and wide. The prize is international. The nominees, finalists, winners, and juries all come from many, many different countries. But as Mike said, this is the first time the announcement of the winner has been made across the pond. The fact that the venue is here at the Natural History Museum is something very special to us at Durrell, because it was here that the memorial service for Gerald Durrell was held after he passed away in 1995. Gerald Durrell himself was overjoyed with Carl's achievements, especially because they unfolded on the island of Mauritius, the land of the dodo. As you all know, this extinct bird was a powerful symbol for Jerry of the urgent need to protect species from the ravages of humankind. And it was the symbol he chose for the Conservation Trust that he established in Jersey 53 years ago. Jerry's and Carl's paths crossed on a number of occasions, both in Mauritius and in Jersey, and Jerry once famously described Carl as a man with sparkling eyes, a wide, warm grin, and brown hair like some sort of uncontrollable seaweed. Now, when Carl was a boy, he found a mentor and inspiring role model in Gerald Durrell. The vital importance of a childhood mentor is nowhere better demonstrated than by young Durrell himself. When growing up on the Greek island of Corfu, he was guided by a brilliant scientist and poet, Dr. Theodore Stephanides. And it's most appropriate that one of our guests on this momentous occasion is Milo Parker, the lad who plays the young Gerald Durrell in the new hit television series, The Durrells. And we are all hoping and praying that the series inspires today's youngsters to follow in the footsteps of Gerald Durrell and of Carl Jones. Carl Jones not only saves species, he inspires people. During his early years in Mauritius, he created an international volunteer program for young people who literally flocked from the four corners of the earth to join Carl in saving the fauna, flora, and habitats of his beloved Mauritius and nearby islands. He stimulated the interest, support, and talent of the Mauritius government, university, and local business communities, which, with encouragement and backing from Durrell, came together as the Mauritian Wildlife Foundation, which is the largest and most active environmental NGO in the region, and Carl Jones is its scientific director. Durrell greatly values its long-term partnership with the foundation and celebrates the many shared successes. And we're delighted that Debbie de Chazal, Executive Director, and Vikash Tataya, Conservation Director, are with us today. And now I would like to introduce Tim Taylor, President of Mauritian Wildlife Foundation, to say a few words on the honor bestowed on our favorite son, Carl Jones. Tim, thank you.
Thank you, Lee. Hello, everybody. I'm going to say a few words about Mauritius. You know a little bit. I think a lot of you have been there, and Carl has said something already. A few words about Durrell and Mauritius, Carl and Mauritius, and then Mauritian Wildlife, that's us, and also the Indianapolis Prize. Mauritius, well, I was born there, but when I was at school here, Mauritius was basically known for two things. It had a stamp, the blue Mauritius, some of you may remember that, and it had a dodo, and it was as dead as the dodo. I say the Mauritians were proud of the dodo. They were proud of the dodo. Even Air Mauritius, it had as its logo the dodo, till someone said it wasn't appropriate for an airline to have a flightless bird as a logo, so it changed to a tropic bird, a red-tailed tropic bird, which is clearly a better one. So yes, things were pretty desperate. Normal things, habitat erosion, DDT. Some of you may remember it. It hasn't been around for some time. But DDT was used to get rid of mosquitoes, got rid of malaria, but it also did a lot to get rid of the kestrel. I think that was one of the main problems with the kestrel, wasn't it, Carl, the DDT? And there was a general lack of caring. I mean, the Mauritian government, it was the last thing on their minds. We were newly independent and they had other things. Perhaps rightly, people were poor, there were lack of jobs, etc. So Mauritius, from an environmental point of view, from a conservation point of view, was really in the pits. And then firstly came Gerald Durrell, who unfortunately I never met. And I read about him, and he went all over the world and collected animals, and he liked Mauritius. I think he liked the golden bats and the pink pigeons. They were exotic, and he liked all that. And he took some of them back to Jersey. And then along came Carl. He wasn't the first. He was the sixth. The international bird community had sent a number of people to Mauritius to try to save the birds. They'd all thrown their hands up and ran away. But Carl came. Now, did he fall in love with us? I'm not sure. But, you know, he stayed. And Durrell supported him. That was important, because no one had any money. Durrell had a bit, but well, no one else had very much. And conservation cost money, as you all know. So Durrell, in fact, set up the Mauritian Wildlife. This was to get money. We were firstly set up to get money. We've done a bit more than getting money. And Carl devoted his life to Mauritius and to the Mauritian birds. And I think we must be very, very thankful, because, you know, today, you know, and when we talk of the dodo, that wasn't the only thing that went extinct in Mauritius. There were about 20 other species as well. And today, from being a sort of a role model is hardly the right word, but an example of extinction, Mauritius is now completely the opposite. There have been more birds brought back and also reptiles brought back from the brink of extinction in Mauritius than in any other country in the world, than in America. You know, America's big, Mauritius is little. So I think we need to be very proud, and I think we need to be very thankful to Carl. We need to be thankful to Durrell, because, you know, I think if they hadn't come along, I think, you know, instead of 20 extinct species, we're probably looking at about 25 now. So it's been a great journey. You've done real well. And, you know, I looked up a hero. I thought, you know, when I said I saw that the Indianapolis Prize was conservation hero, so I thought I'd better Google it just to see what a hero was. And it's quite interesting. And then I sort of says, does Carl measure up? When you Google hero and Wikipedia, very good, it says it's somebody who combats adversity. Certainly he stacks up on that. With ingenuity, absolutely. Bravery, yes. I mean, it's not, you know, one of Carl said he thought that he didn't stand a great chance with the Indianapolis Prize because our animals weren't exciting enough. You know, being mauled by a pink pigeon, you don't need to be very brave to deal with pink pigeons, but you do have to be brave, because, you know, some of the birds died, and there was, at the beginning, you know, birds don't always do what you would like them to do. And then, you know, you've actually got to continue, you've got to say, right, what can we learn, etc. You know, Carl thought he had this wonderful idea to send Mauritian phodies to Round Island, known for its snakes. After about 2 weeks, there was one left. The rest had been eaten by the snakes, and that one was eaten as well. So he decided that wasn't probably such a great idea. But obviously, you know, you don't always win, and if you don't win, you've got to get up and you've got to do something else, and you've got to get it right. And he's done all of that, because you can see the results. The results are fantastic. So I would like to say thank you, Carl. I would like to say thank you to Durrell as well, because we very much needed you, and we still need you. You know, Durrell paid Carl for years. Carl worked with us, and they paid him. That's a wonderful arrangement. And also, you know, Mauritian Wildlife, we are now 120 strong. We've got many, many Mauritians working there now. We haven't won the battle. We spar with governments still. We've sparred with them for the last 40 years. It's better sometimes and less good at other times, but we are making progress. We've got lots of Mauritians now interested in conservation, which we didn't have before. That's clearly good. So it's been very good for Mauritius, not just the birds, but for Mauritius as a whole. And I would like to say thank you to the Indianapolis Zoo for the prize. I'm sure Carl needs the money. There's no money in conservation. And anyway, many thanks. And we are all happy to be here with Carl. You're giving the prize. Thank you very much, everybody.
Tim, thank you very much. That was lovely. And now we're going to move on to the final portion of our program, which will be a panel discussion about the future of animal conservation. And it gives me great pleasure to introduce to you the panel chairman, Professor E.J. Milner-Gulland, who is Professor of Biodiversity in the Department of Zoology at Oxford and also a trustee of Durrell Wildlife Conservation Trust. E.J.
Thank you. Okay, if the panelists would like to come up. So I'm just going to give short introductions to each of our distinguished panelists, and then we'll move on to some interesting, hopefully thought-provoking questions. So in his role as President and CEO of the Indianapolis Zoological Society, Mike Crowther was the driving force behind the creation and the implementation of the Indianapolis Prize, which is an integral part of the zoo's mission to empower people and communities locally and globally, to advance animal conservation. But as well as his work with the Indianapolis Zoological Society, Mike works on several boards and committees, including the Diane Fossey Gorilla Fund International and the International Species Information System. And he's led expeditions to some very enviable places, including Rwanda, Uganda, Tanzania, South Africa. Before you all get jealous, I'll stop reading. And move on to Lee. So Dr. Lee Durrell's starry career in conservation began in the early 1970s, when she lived in Madagascar and conducted research on animal vocalizations for her PhD dissertation. And then from 1983 to 2001, she ran the Madagascar Conservation Programme of Durrell Wildlife Conservation Trust, which was established, as we all know, by Jerry. This Madagascar programme, one of the things she did there was to start the project for the recovery of the critically endangered ploughshare tortoise, which is still going on, and that earned her the nickname Grandmother of the Tortoise in Madagascar. And in 2011, Lee was awarded an MBE for her services to conservation. Well, I'm going to do a bit more introduction of Carl, just in case you haven't heard enough. He's a world-renowned conservationist who saved at least 9 animal species from extinction over his career. He's worked in Mauritius for 4 decades and has led the efforts to save numerous species, which again I won't list. He's also helped establish the first national park in the country. He championed new and exciting conservation methods and has trained many, many conservationists and scientists to carry on his legacy. It gives me great pleasure to introduce Dr. Vikash Tataya, who you saw in the photos, who has worked alongside Carl Jones in Mauritius for more than 20 years. As Conservation Director of the Mauritius Wildlife Foundation, he oversees programs on Mauritius and Rodrigues that have led to the recovery of numerous threatened species, and serves as a liaison and a focal point for the Mauritian government on conservation issues. So he works on lots of national conservation and environmental consultations and with various other national and international organisations. He's also the co-chair of the IUCN Mascarene Island Plant Specialist Group and a member of several other specialist groups of IUCN. Which brings me to Simon Stewart, who is chair of IUCN, the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, the Species Survival Commission part of it. The Species Survival Commission is an extraordinary organisation. It has about 8,000 volunteers, conservationists from all over the world working together to further the aims of conservation. Simon has worked since 1986 with his vision and his leadership to help IUCN in its efforts to conserve the world's biodiversity. Simon also acted as the chief nominator for Carl Jones, and he wrote the following in his citation. Carl's actions prove that conserving threatened species works, but that it takes time. If we are to prevent widespread species extinctions in the coming years, this world desperately needs more people like Carl. Talented, charismatic and visionary, and with a stubborn determination not to give in. Okay, and on that note, I think we'll just move on to some questions for the panel. So, my first question, in fact, is for Simon, and I wondered if you could just say a bit about how animal conservation is at the moment. What's the current state of conservation in the world, particularly species recovery?
Thank you, EJ. Well, I think actually the data are quite straightforward on it. That if you look at all the main groups of animals, if you look at birds, mammals, whatever, they all have very elevated levels of threat. So, 25% of mammals at least threatened with extinction globally, 12% for birds, it's over 40% for amphibians, probably around 20% for reptiles, etc. So we have these very elevated levels of extinction risk due to human activity, and in all groups the trend is getting worse, it's going down. But having said that, recent studies, including important ones done by Durrell, led by Rich Young, have shown that if conservation wasn't taking place, things would be much worse than they are now. So the main problem with conservation is not that it doesn't work, but we just don't do anything like enough of it for long enough and keep focused at it.
Okay, yeah. So I think I'll move on to the rest of the panel and just ask you to say, with that backdrop, Vikash, what do you think is the most difficult, biggest challenge to conservation today?
I think there are many challenges, and to start with, one of the things that you'll always hear is we don't have enough funding for the work. And I think it's been said too often, but I think it is true that conservation costs a lot of money, and we need to have people who are willing to fund this conservation work. And it's not a short-term effort to try to save a species. It often takes 20 years, and as my mentor Carl will say, it takes 100 years probably to save some of these species. So you need to be in for a very long period if you're going to make a difference to these species. But besides funding, I think it's especially crucially so in the developed world and in small islands, developing states like Mauritius, it's human capacity. So finding the right people on small islands where most of the biodiversity, which Simon has talked about, is probably most endangered, to get a local capacity and to get in people from abroad to help save species. So I think it is also that which is crucially important, and it's still so on Mauritius. Although Carl has said in his speech that we bring in a lot of people, a lot of them who are in this room and have been helping us. And although we are also developing local capacity, we still need a lot of expertise internationally. So that expertise is also one of the crucial factors in turning the tide. But a third thing is and is something that we should work on, is policy. How to get policy aligned towards conservation. And it's not always aligned in that direction.
Great, thank you. Carl?
I think Vikash has highlighted some very interesting points. It does take a long time to save species. And I think that one of the problems we have is there's too many academics telling us what we should be doing and not enough practitioners out there doing it. And I think there's a mismatch between the academics and the people out there with the boots on. I think we need to teach people a lot of practical skills. We get lots of people who know all about small population biology but don't know how to catch a cat. So we need to be a bit more practical, I think. So yes, we do need money. Of course we need money. We do need time. We need to really put a lot of effort into projects. And I think that one of the criticisms that I have of many conservation organizations is that they suffer from fatigue. They're involved with the species for a few years and then they get bored and they say, let's go and work on tigers. They're far more interesting. And so they leave the small, less charismatic species. So we need people who are prepared to commit themselves long term, decades. We need organizations that commit themselves for centuries. And we need people with the skills to deliver.
Great. Lee?
I think fundamentally, I think it's that the animal kingdom, of which there are maybe 10 million species, is so much in competition with one species, which is our own. And I do think that the world is overpopulated. It's not maybe a popular political thing to say, but I feel really very strongly about that. The problem is, though, that the number of people alive today, and they have let's say they have very few children, there's still going to be a big bubble of huge number of people, 10 billion. I think we can't avoid that. So we're going to have to do something else, as well as think about having fewer children. We're going to have to be doing something else. So, yeah. But big challenge, yeah.
Well, I think that, as Lee and many others said, one of the biggest challenges for other species is our species. And we have this incredible inclination to look 3 feet in front of our nose all the time instead of 3 miles down the road. And I think that perhaps the most important thing that we can teach our children is how to look further down the road and beyond their own doorsteps. And if we can do that, we can accomplish a great deal for the rest of the world.
Great. So that was a great opportunity for conservation. So I wonder if anybody else has got any opportunities that they'd like to highlight after the challenges.
I think one huge opportunity, and for me, the old Luddite saying this, is the mass communication we've got today. The, social media and all that will and does reach so many people. And if we can just keep that up, but do it right, do it smart, do it so that people want to listen and tune in to what we're saying about conservation of the planet and animal species and ecosystems. That's a huge opportunity that we should all be trying to take.
I'm going to address my colleagues here who work in the zoo community, because I think zoos have had a lot of criticism recently, some of it perhaps justified in some ways, but I think that zoos actually can contribute a great deal more. I think that when we actually look at conservation worldwide, I told you there's this mismatch between the practitioners and the academics. Yeah. And one of the problems is we don't have enough people with animal skills to go out there and work with critically endangered species. And it's only the people that work with captive animals that really have those skills developed to a fine art. So I think zoos are far more important than they give themselves credit for. The future for zoos is not keeping and breeding animals in captivity, but learning from captive animals so we can then manage species in the wild. And that's the challenge for the future.
Well, I think there are two other opportunities. One of them is climate change. There's a lot of debate and a lot of concern about climate change, just as there is for conservation. But I think we should actually make the connection between climate change and conservation, loss of biodiversity. And that connection is not quite being made, simply because, for one thing, is that we don't quite understand the effect. We can't measure it. We can predict it, we can't measure it precisely. And I think we have to actually make people more aware of the biodiversity loss that will happen with climate change. And to see how we can take actions not only to have a better world physically, but also to have a lot more species around in 40 or 50 years. And I think the other great opportunity is actually conservation genetics. And how I think there are only a few examples of that starting, but I think the next 10, 20 years will be quite interesting in terms of how we are going to be using genetics to help save species. And I'm not just talking about animals, I'm talking about plants as well here.
Exactly.
Yes, I agree with all of that. Another interesting trend I find, so I have to go around the world and give a lot of talks, is the rapidly increasing number of very keen young people in conservation in many parts of the world. So I remember going 25 years ago to work on a meeting in Indonesia, and it was one of the most deadly difficult and dull experiences because of the sheer lack of engagement and the political control of the meeting. Going back after 20 years and running a very similar sort of meeting, it was crowded with young students, all passionate about conservation. I've seen the same in countries you wouldn't expect, United Arab Emirates, last year at a meeting again, full of young people, men and women, all wanting to be involved in conservation. Brazil, where I've just been, you see the same thing happening. But I think that most of these people are not learning what Carl just said, animal skills. They're not getting that opportunity. And probably most of them would love to have it and could really benefit from it. So I think we've got this growing pool of enthusiasm and expertise, but not the training towards the hands-on stuff. And that's probably a real opportunity.
Great. Okay, so I'm just going to ask Mike. So the Indianapolis Prize is set up because animal conservation is recognised by Indianapolis Zoo to be really important to the health and prosperity of future generations. And I just wondered if you'd like to just expand on that a little bit and explain why.
Well, certainly. I think our greatest responsibility to future generations is to provide them with a future that they would choose to live in, not one that they're forced to endure. And that future needs to have blue skies and clear lakes and waters and green valleys and spectacular ice meadows and wonderful plains. And I can't imagine bringing children into the world who are forced to live in some kind of a Mad Max environment where it's a barren, sterile world that requires artificial systems in order to sustain it. We need to provide our children and our grandchildren with the kind of rich, functioning environments that not only sustain biodiversity, but sustain them and continue to provide all of the ecosystem services which we depend on for our own existence.
Has anyone got anything they'd like to add to that? Okay, well, we'll move on. And then, Carl, you've had a long time working in conservation, 4 decades. And I just wondered if you could give us a longer perspective of how things have changed over those 4 decades and how you see them changing in the next 4 decades.
There's been a lot of changes, and I think one of the main ones is that it's now becoming more accepted to manage species in the wild. When we first started working with some of the endangered species in Mauritius, a lot of people were very down on the fact that we wanted to feed wild birds, for example, or put up nest boxes. They said, well, we've got to repair the habitat and then they'll be fine. But of course, to repair the habitat may take 100 years or something. So there's been a greater acceptance in the fact that we need to manage species. And not only in Mauritius, we only have to look at some of the work that's done in New Zealand with kakapo, look at North America with California condor. These species are only surviving with management. I think it's unfortunate we have to manage them, but the very fact that we manage them is actually helping us understand what the issues are and actually helping to correct them. So I think we need to embrace management a lot more and to develop the techniques for that. I think that has been one of the biggest changes. And of course, there's been a tremendous growth in knowledge and science. And as I pointed out earlier on, I think that one of the challenges is how do you actually apply all that? There's lots of people telling you what you should do, but then when it comes to actually applying it to the field, it's a lot more difficult. So I think that's it's been a wonderful move forward with all this knowledge, but I think it's a challenge learning how to implement that.
Would anyone else like to give the benefit of their decades of experience?
I think one of the things that we've seen are a number of remarkable individuals like Carl have developed a new toolbox for us. When conservation was in its infancy, we had to make things up as we went along, and as we learned with Round Island, that doesn't always work. But when folks like George Schaller, folks like Carl, like Ian Douglas Hamilton, like so many others, have developed new methodologies which are replicable in other environments and other ecosystems. So a new conservationist going and working in the middle of Uganda doesn't have to invent everything. They can choose from their menu what is available, and therefore we're seeing victories. There's a lot of bad things happening, but we're seeing more victories than we've ever seen before, and I think that's because we have acquired such a knowledge base from the people who have gone before us.
I think a real difference has been the movement towards community conservation and involving local people around the places where your target species lives, whereas 30, 40 years ago, people just wanted to put a fence around a forest and that was it. But we all know now that doesn't work, and you must bring on the local communities into what you're doing and empower them to do it for themselves, and that's certainly what Darryl's been doing in Madagascar.
So I can't do 37 years like Carl, I can only do 30 years. But over that time, we've seen the conservation movement professionalize in certain ways, and that has some good sides to it. Certainly the things in many ways are being done more efficiently and better, but there's also a tendency for to get lost, especially around some politically correct ideas from time to time, and suddenly ecosystem services are the fashion, and then everyone runs after that, and then it's natural capital is the fashion, and everyone runs after that. And there's nothing actually wrong with any of that, but it's a sort of lack of consistency and long-term focus is around it. And through all of that, you've tended to see the basics get forgotten, which are the species that still need the basic work doing with them, the hands-on work that Carl's been talking about. And you've seen organizations tending to drift away from that. Some drift away, some drift back, but there's been often have moved away from it. And this has opened up a huge opportunity for zoos. Because there's going to be more need for hands-on work in the wild on species, zoos are going to have to fill that niche, because there really isn't any other entity that can do it.
Well, I can't put 37 years, obviously. I've been the youngest around. But I think we are in the middle of a communications revolution. Carl, the announcement that Carl had won the Indianapolis Prize, it was on all the Facebook pages, Twitter, and so on at 5 a.m. this morning. And otherwise, in the old days, 37 years ago, it would have had to be telegraphing from left, right, and center. So you can see that the changes, the speed at communication is happening, and people can share links. And I think we are in a phase where we'll be able to communicate to all corners of the globe more rapidly, more effectively, I hope, about the not just the gloom and the doom. Unfortunately, most often it's the gloom and the doom that goes across and brings about a spirit of pessimism. But I think we'll be able to share the conservation success stories throughout the world and get people inspired. And I think this is where the conservation community must take full advantage of the communications technologies and the advances in it. And I think that is the great opportunity.
So would anyone like to look in the crystal ball and think 40 years forward and feel positive or negative about where we'll be?
I don't think it's possible to have people like this working in the world and not feel positive about it. And the great thing is, as many mentioned, is that it's not just the work that individuals have done, but the dozens of people who have flowed out from them. Everyone here has had dozens or hundreds of, I hate to call them acolytes, but people who have learned at their feet and are now going out and doing great work. I'm really excited about this. I also think that one of the big differences is we've learned what it takes to make change. We talk about the paradigm of first engage, then enlighten, and then empower. But it used to be that people would do one of those very well and forget the others. You can't do anything until you first of all engage people and get their interest and get their attention. So people are doing that. I mean, that's what Jerry did so well. Then, once they are engaged, you can enlighten them. You can teach them something, reveal something they didn't know before, and then empower them by giving them pathways to making a difference. So I am optimistic because of the people, because of the knowledge, and because of the maturation of our techniques and our technologies.
Great. Okay, so just want to come back to Simon about, your kind of setting the scene at the beginning. So the Indianapolis Prize, part of what it celebrates is innovation. And you were giving us the picture of 25% of mammals being endangered and so on. So we need a step change. So can you tell us what you think might be the step change that we can get in conservation? How do we get that step change?
Oh goodness, that's not the question I thought you were going to ask, EJ, but never mind. It's worded differently here. No, Well, but to answer the question you actually asked, I think we have to do a whole set of things. And one would be what I suggested earlier: get that massive enthusiasm of young people coming through across the world into hands-on animal and plant management. Those connections I don't think are yet being made. So in other words, to create from the enthusiasm, create a practical conservation movement in the countries where most biodiversity occurs. Another is we need a change in political will. In most countries there's some sort of sympathy towards the causes that we all feel so passionately about here, but they're not that high up the political agenda, and in fact in certain instances we've seen certain types of political movements rolling back environmental safeguards in certain parts of the world. And so we have to mobilize that public support that we know we have in favor of big changes. And it may be that some of the changes we need to save species do impact on human lifestyles, and we may have to live more simply, require less space, be less greedily, be fewer of us, all of that. And I think most politicians believe that the public is not willing to pay those costs. And so we somehow need to work with publics to help them understand the cost and to show their commitment to pay those costs.
Great. Any other thoughts on that, or is that summing that up? Great. Okay. So we've heard about the amazing work that's been done in Mauritius by Carl and Vikash and all your colleagues. And I guess one slightly cynical question might be, is this something special about Mauritius? Did it succeed because of Mauritius, or is it something that can be scaled up? Is it something that's applicable elsewhere? So I'm going to ask Vikash and Carl, why did it work in Mauritius, and could it have worked elsewhere?
I think it works in Mauritius, and it can and should work elsewhere. The model is quite simple when you think about it. We bring in a lot of very young and very passionate scientists, and many of them are in this room here, and who stay with us for 6 months, a year, and 2 years, and go on to do even far greater things elsewhere. And some of them are going full circle by actually then coming to support us. You know, we heard of Malcolm and Jim and all the rest who are today our greatest supporters and in the research. And I think this model can be applied anywhere in the world, and should be applied anywhere in the world. And also the thing to do is, it's also what's worked in Mauritius is the partnerships. So what Carl has been able to create over the years is to get very important funders, conservation organizations, universities, academics, and people in government to be on the same side and to work towards a common goal. And I think what has happened in Mauritius, and which has worked very well, is partnerships. And if this is what's going to continue working in future. You can have very critical ecosystems, but it's people who are going to make a difference. And it relies on champions to make the difference. I think here, these are the ingredients of it, and also training. We have always trained the staff, but now we've taken that to a significant level by actually formalizing this training. So we are running, thanks to Daryl, a postgraduate diploma in endangered species management, which we are hoping to turn into a master's. We have many PhD students and master's students from various universities around the world coming to us. And these are the people who train, and as Jerry will say, these are Daryl's armies, and we'll say, well, these are Carl's armies then now.
Great. Carl, do you have anything to add?
Thanks, Vikash. You've answered all the questions before me. I think what's really interesting is that our success has been largely due to the enthusiasm of a lot of the volunteers. We get people who are prepared to give up time, to pay for themselves to come out to Mauritius, and they're full of energy. They want to go and solve problems and save species. And all you have to do is sort of point them in the right direction and guide them a little bit, and they go on and achieve amazing things. And I've seen that happen so many times, and it sort of makes me realise that individuals really can make a difference. And also in Mauritius, I was very lucky that there wasn't too much bureaucracy, or the bureaucracy that was there, you tended to ignore it and just get on with it. It's a little bit more difficult these days, but essentially the government had so much confidence in what we were doing, they let us get on with it. And I think that's one of the reasons why we've been successful. So we had a lot of enthusiastic people that just went out there and achieved great results. And I get the credit.
So your answer nicely segs on to my next question, which is that it's all very well giving up your life to be the most amazing conservationist, but ordinary people in the streets sometimes feel very disempowered because they don't see what they as individuals going to work on an ordinary day, what can they do to help conservation? So I'd just like a little bit of advice for the rest of us mortals from Mike.
I think every Indianapolis Prize winner that there has been has said one thing that is not the first thing that the rest of us think of, but they encourage everyone to travel and to see the places that are so foreign in concept as well as in distance. And it's remarkable that once people do travel and see those environments, they do have a tendency to value them more highly and then develop a way to include them in their own personal ethic. I think one of the most important things that we can do is we need to teach our children. And Simon talked about the need to live more simply. We can't just dispose of things. And I think my mother was the last person who ever darned socks. But, you know, that's just, it's a metaphor for our world. We have to teach our children that we can't just use things and dispose of them. We have to let them see the rest of the world. We have people in our organization who plant trees in orangutan habitat in Borneo. Everybody has the opportunity to do these sort of things. But the more you travel, the more you read, the more you think about the ethical consequences, the more pathways will be revealed.
Any other comments?
I just agree. I think that lifestyle changes are something that everybody's got to think about. Maybe not everybody can travel to Borneo, but everybody can, you know, eat less meat, or can think about what fish you eat, or not even eat any fish, and just, you know, waste less and recycle. And it sounds very sort of trite, but if everybody did it, you know, if everybody switched off that light, all of the energy we'd save. And it's got to be something that's worked into your whole lifestyle, that you don't even think twice about it. That's the important thing.
If we can just move our heading 3 degrees from the course that we're currently following, after a little while we'll be at a totally different destination.
Any other comments from you?
I'm a great believer in biophilia. I think that human beings need wildlife. I think we need contact with the natural world. And I think that one of the problems is that in modern society we tend to see it on a television screen, or through binoculars, or in a cage in a zoo. And I think that contact with nature is very, very important and very powerful. And I think it's something that we should try and encourage a lot more of in our children. And I think that the communication or the contact between animals and humans is very important, and humans and animals. And that's something that needs to be developed a lot more.
And of course, the other thing that everyone can do is write a check to Durrell and the Mauritian Wildlife.
Another thing is, I think the majority of the audience are British. Probably most of us are not aware how little our government gives to international species conservation work compared with other countries in Europe or North America. It's a time of budget cuts, of course, but there's still a very large amount of funds in Department for International Development that could go to species. Doesn't all have to go where it's going at the moment. It's the Darwin Initiative is the main thing that Britain gives, and it's pitifully small, as I don't need to tell you. But this won't change without political pressure. Go and see your MPs. met an MP here this morning. There's the new endangered species group, cross-party group, just been formed last November. These people, is prime time for lobbying and pushing, and the conservation community should really be out there doing that.
Well, I think it's all the small things that one can do, such as recycling, such as eating less or unsustainably produced things, and all of that I think is good. And also talking to your MP. I mean, they are the ones that make the political decisions and shape the policies. But I think that is very important. And an individual can go up to his MP and say something which is happening in his or her own region, and say we should do something about it. And although it might seem trivial, and although it might seem a drop in the ocean, but I want to keep saying to everybody, the ocean is made of these drops. So don't think how small your effort could be, but I think if we join up all these small efforts, we can actually make quite a substantial change.
Great. So in order for people to make those changes in their lives, they need to be inspired. And the winners of the Indianapolis Prize are inspiring people. And Jerry Durrell was an inspiration to many people, and he inspired Kyle, and now we're lucky that Kyle is inspiring us. So just for a last point from everyone quickly, can you think of ways to inspire people to turn them into Carl Jones? Mike, who wants to start? Do you want to start, Lee?
Well, I'll just start, and really it's reiterating what Carl said, and that is let us let our children outdoors and learn about nature. I mean, they're so separated from nature now, and people are so scared to let their children even do anything. But, I remember when I was a child, I would go out in the woods and make leaf collections and watch ants and such things, and just get your children to, and go with them. You can go with them.
Anyone else got an inspiring tip, Simon?
Yeah, so when I was a child growing up in Dorset, I used to go and catch adders and take them home and terrorise my parents. It's illegal now. Catching the adders, not terrorising your parents. There might be good reasons why that's illegal, but unfortunately, the effect of much conservation legislation has been to separate people from nature, and that biophilia, that love of nature, comes from being amongst nature and learning about it, learning natural history skills. Having a mentor, all those things, and our urbanized society makes that harder. And so I think one thing we can do is to get our children, our relatives, our friends, whatever, out into nature, talk about it, show our love for nature to them.
Great.
Well, as somebody from the generation down from Carl, rather from on the same generation of Carl. When I came to Merchant Wildlife, I would never imagine that I would be here 20 years later. And so Carl has truly been an inspiration for me and a mentor as well. He doesn't only have great qualities, he's got some faults as well. And those of us who've been with him would know that. Is terribly disorganized. And I'm sure Paula has to keep it in the ranks, just as we try in Merchant Wildlife to keep him in path. And I'm sure you do in Durrell as well. But I think it's. But I'm sure. But it's. I think we need more mentors like him. I had the privilege of having a mentor like Carl, and many of us in Merchant Wildlife Foundation have. And I just hope that every generation will have a lot of these champions, a lot of these mentors that we can look up to and find guidance.
Carl, would you like to respond to that?
It's not true.
Okay. Right.
That was the extent of it.
Any last words on how to inspire the next generation?
I recognize this is not something everyone can do. I took my two daughters to Kenya when they were young, and they're both involved in this now for the rest of their lives. We need to. When I was 6 years old, I told my mother that I wanted to be Desmond Morris when I grew up, and she told me that was a not a respectable profession and I needed to go and do something else. We need to tell our children that this is an incredible adventure. It is a great opportunity for victories and a life of excitement and accomplishment. Everyone is right about biophilia. We feel better when we are in a world of diverse nature and our eyes start shining and it's just wondrous. We need to expose that to our children and to our friends. We need to take people into the woods. We need to tell them stories. We need to show them movies. We've got to let people see things through eyes of wonder. A good friend of mine once said that the way to teach people is to let people see what is authentically wondrous about the subject matter. So let's find the authentically wondrous parts of biodiversity and expose the rest of the world to it. And they'll join us because it's too wonderful an adventure to ignore.
Great. Okay, so there's just a couple of minutes left in which we can have a few questions from the audience. If we've got the people with the mics around, you just stick your hand up if you've got something you'd like to ask anyone in the panel. Can you stand up and just identify yourself?
Thank you. Really inspiring. Nigel Windsor, conservationist. I love the fact that you recommend it's easier to ask for forgiveness than to ask for permission, Carl. I like that. Having been in the world of conservation for 40 years, what I'd like to ask the panel is, to turn the tide that you talk about, Vikash, what needs to be done today to change the mindsets of those in governments, in businesses, and in civil society who have access to the funding that you're talking about? What do we need to do that we are not doing today?
Maybe we'll start with Simon on that and then go to Vikash, because it was Simon's.
I sort of had an attempt at answering it earlier. So I think with governments, and I'm not, Nigel, don't really feel able to answer it for businesses, but for governments, I think we do have to try and help them to understand that the public feel much more strongly about this issue than they believe is the case, and they believe the public has bigger preoccupations than conservation, to be honest. And if we're wrong and the public doesn't feel that, then we do have to communicate better with the public to stir up that interest and that commitment and passion that I believe is there. But in the end, government follow what they think society wants. They tend not to lead, I think. And so by influencing society, in the end, you influence government.
Vikash.
Well, I think I join you with what you said about the government. I think if governments know that to get more votes, it means you need to be addressing the conservation concerns, environmental concerns of your electors, I think they'll be switching to that mode. But I'd also say that for businesses, it's the same thing. Nowadays, more and more, we're talking of business and biodiversity. So saving biodiversity, it used to be seen as throwing money down a well. Now, a lot of businesses are seeing it as a way to make more profits. But I don't think there's anything wrong making more money and saving more plants and more animals. And I think we need to see this balance. And some of the businesses out there are actually seeing how they can cash in a positive sense, on better biodiversity. And I think and that will go the same thing for people as well. You know, one of the big problems we have in Mauritius is we say pink pigeon will be lost, and how does that touch upon the lives of the people on the island? And a lot of people don't see the connection. And it's how we can actually communicate that connection to the people. And if the people feel that it's a loss to them if there is a species or a plant that goes extinct, they will think differently. And I think making that connection is important.
Cool.
I've been surprised to discover how human some politicians actually are. And in my career, I've had the opportunity to take several into the field to show them the work. And I remember taking the Prime Minister out to feed the Mauritius kestrels one day, and took him up to the nest site and we fed the kestrels. And he didn't seem very enthusiastic. However, a few months later, when they were debating whether or not to have a national park in Mauritius, he actually talked about that experience. So I think actually taking them out there and showing them it can have a great influence, can actually make them appreciate it a lot more when they realize it's what's there. You know, it's one thing to actually see a bird through a pair of binoculars, but to actually go up and see one just a few feet away or to feed it is a very, very powerful experience.
Shall we have another question?
Yes, sir.
Any more questions? There's one right over there.
My name's Roger Safford. I'm going to say I'm from the Mauritian Wildlife Foundation, and always will be, although at the moment I work for BirdLife. My question is about leadership. We conservationists, we're very nice people, and many of us are very expert, but we're mostly sheep. How do we generate real conservation leaders like Carl?
Any suggestions on that?
I think that it's really important that conservationists learn storytelling as a part of their academic curriculum. I mean, you've got to learn statistics. Why shouldn't you have to learn storytelling? Because the magic occurs when you connect what you're doing with someone else. And I think it's really critical that that scientists recognize that it's important that they build bridges between them and people who are not scientists.
Okay. Another question? One more, maybe. Yes, in the middle there.
It's Don Wormel from Durrell. I'd just like to ask the panel whether they see, the threat of climate change. Everyone talks as this great big monster on the horizon, but in many ways it's an opportunity for conservationists to tell politicians that we need to restore systems to mitigate against the worst effects of climate change, and that's just pure objective science. We have to do that. And how do we actually get that point across to politicians?
Well, it's hard to know where to start on climate change, but probably when we're looking at the impact of climate change on species and what's going on right now that is incontrovertibly due to climate change, you have to look at coral reefs. And the bleaching of corals that's going to get worse and worse if ocean surface temperatures go up, coupled with ocean acidification, which is not climate change, but it's caused by the same factor of rising CO2, is basically going to wipe out coral reefs in the coming decades and completely change ocean chemistry. Now, that is going to have a massive impact on human livelihoods, on coastal fisheries, on the erosion of coastlines in the tropics, etc. So if politicians aren't bothered about that, I don't know what they're bothered about. So that's an example of where I think a very clear example of where climate change threats and the needs of species and ecosystems and how that affects the sorts of things that matter to the livelihoods of people and therefore political processes is very clear. Of course, sea level rise comes into it as well, melting of ice caps and other things like that. But climate change is we spoke about what had happened in the last 37 years in conservation. No one was talking about climate change 37 years ago. Now we are. And unfortunately, there are more and more cases of climate change impacting species.
Any other comments?
I think we are actually seeing more government interest in this than we're aware of, but it exists at an agency or ministry level. For example, we're seeing range changes, obviously, in songbirds and in a lot of ocean life. And we're also seeing significant pandemics that are carried by birds. So we have heard of many government agencies that are interested in the potential broad-scale public health effects of climate change. Whether they can persuade their political bosses to pay attention or not, I don't know. But the professionals, they are paying some attention.
Brilliant. Right, well, I think it's time to bring this panel session to an end and move on to the next part of the celebration. I'm sure you'd all like to join me to thank the panelists for their interesting and inspirational insights. And also, I'm lucky enough to be able to thank the Indianapolis Prize and Mike and all his colleagues for awarding Carl this prize and for coming all the way here to be with us today. To give him that award, Walter.
Thank you.
And also like to thank Durrell and the Marine Wildlife Foundation for putting on this great event. I'd like to thank the Natural History Museum. I'd like to thank all the people who've organised behind the scenes, like Ollie standing there with his mic. And I'd like to thank all of you for coming and remind you that there's drinks next door. And then if you want a bit more hardcore celebration, you've all been invited to the Pink Pigeon at Rum event at the library. You know where to go. So let's put our hands together to thank all those people.